She was a young mother trying to leave the street life behind.
She wanted to set a good example for her daughter.
She had already enrolled in college.
She was trying to become a nurse.
She really set her sights on a new life.
But she would never get the chance.
There was smoke coming out of the house.
There apparently had been food burning on the stove.
There was a trail of blood that led to her body.
She was shot twice in her face.
Had her life on the streets finally caught up to her?
A lot of young people don't understand what comes with that lifestyle.
Most of the homicides that I covered were related to drugs.
Was it a more personal motive?
She had no clothing from her waist down.
Was she sexually assaulted?
Or did someone see her new life as a threat?
She had to leave him.
He wanted to continue that lifestyle.
And without her, he was nothing.
December 20th, 1996. Christmas is just around the corner in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a city of 50,000, 2 hours west of Philly.
Harrisburg is very interesting in that it is the capital city of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, so there are a lot of opportunities here, lots of jobs and state government. But then when you look within certain parts of the city, you do see where there are impoverished people.
And in 1996, there are few places in Harrisburg more impoverished than the Allison Hill neighborhood.
It's a community that has suffered, and they've been trying to revitalize it for many years, but unfortunately, a lot of criminal activity still happens there.
There's a lot of drug abuse. There's a lot of panhandling, poverty. Socioeconomic status is pretty low.
There's a lot of homicides in Allison Hill. You go there and neighbors are worried about their neighborhood.
And for one Allison Hill resident, this afternoon brings a new worry. It's a little after noon when Iris Belcher's brother notices smoke coming from the home across the street where his sister Iris lives.
He was really concerned about his sister.
Rushing over, he's met outside by Iris's boyfriend, Tyshant Love.
Where's Iris? She's upstairs.
As soon as that happened, he told the brother that something was wrong with Iris. And he took the brother into the house.
She's upstairs. It's bad.
Come on.
He said he came home and found something burning on the stove.
There was blood downstairs in the kitchen, and there was blood spatter going upstairs.
And when he followed the blood upstairs, he found Iris.
She was on the floor, laid down.
She was shot twice in her face.
At first glance, 20-year-old Iris Spinell Belcher appeared to have a bright future ahead of her.
She was a beautiful young woman, very intelligent young woman.
Iris had a really bubbly personality. She was just immediately likable. Everyone that came into contact with her really liked her. And she seemed to have so much potential.
But she'd also faced plenty of obstacles in her short life.
The environment she grew up in was extremely difficult.
It's difficult when there's a lot of drug trade to persevere through all of the outside influences that may bring you down.
And an unexpected pregnancy at age 15 didn't help.
Having a child at an early age is quite stressful.
That's a lot of balls to juggle.
If you don't have any help or any support, that alone can be extremely stressful or anxiety-provoking. How can you take care of yourself and take care of a child?
With few options to support herself, after Iris moved out on her own, she turned to drug dealing.
How Iris grew up explains a lot of why she entered the drug business.
Sometimes when people grow up in crime areas, it is ingrained in them.
It's just a twisted system. If you're coming up in that system, and you're trying to say, I want to better myself, how do you get money?
Unfortunately, we don't live in a society where everyone has an equal opportunity to make a great life for themselves. And sometimes people do feel that the only option they have is to deal drugs or engage in some other illegal activity.
That's what she knew, and she was comfortable around it.
She was also good at it.
She was extremely intelligent, so it was easy for her to pick it up and make money doing it and support herself and her daughter.
She became really well known within the drug community and successful.
And she soon fell in with a group of dealers based out of New York City.
We had a lot of individuals coming down from New York City and selling drugs here because it was so lucrative. The drugs would be sold for so much more money, and they kept their contacts in New York, and then they would come down here and sell the drugs for more money and make a profit.
One of those New York drug dealers was Tyshant Love.
He was known as the professor. He had a studious air about him.
I never understood the relationship. It was one of those relationships where you look and you go, I don't get it. But she was in that drug life. He was in that drug life. They had lots in common.
But what really brought them together was the way Tyshant treated Iris's daughter.
Hey, man. Oh no, she sleep already?
Yeah, I just got her down.
I got this for her.
As a single mother, when the person that is now in the picture and is accepting of the child that you had before them, it does bring a sense of hope and a sense of family.
Well, you stay the night, right?
I mean, yeah, I can just give it to her tomorrow.
Okay, sounds good.
That's where the connection became strong.
Ooh, I love the way that sounds.
The thought of becoming a family also sparked a change in Iris.
She wanted to better her life.
She was trying to get out of the drug trade and do something better for her family. One of the ways you do that is by education.
She had been accepted into the nursing program at Harrisburg Area Community College.
She really set her sights on a new life.
But now it appears that Iris's new life has come to a sudden, violent end.
After seeing smoke coming from her house, Iris's brother goes across the street to investigate.
He approached the property and he saw Tyshant come out. He was very panicked.
Yo, where's Iris? She's upstairs. It's bad.
He took the brother into the house. They found Iris.
She was found in the bedroom with gunshot wounds.
Tyshant told her brother, "You call 911."
Call 911, call 911.
And then he left the scene.
Iris, wake up, Iris. Hey, where you going?
After years of dealing drugs to make ends meet, single mother Iris Fennell Belcher was turning her life around.
She wanted more for her life and for her daughter. She decided she wanted out of the game, and she applied and got accepted to nursing school.
But now it's Iris who's in desperate need of medical attention.
Her boyfriend Tyshant and her brother have just found Iris on her bedroom floor.
She was found in the bedroom with gunshot wounds.
And then, after telling Iris's brother to call 911, Tyshant had run out the door.
I'll be back. I'll be right back. I'll be right back.
Tyshant said something along the lines of, "I know what happened, and I'm going to go take care of it."
Within minutes, sirens converge on the neighborhood.
It's chaotic. There's a lot of police that show up.
They enter the house with guns drawn.
Hurry! She's right here!
The first thing the officer has to do in a situation like this is actually clear the house.
But all they find is Iris's body on the bedroom floor.
She had two very close contact wounds, one going to the front of her mouth and one that went through her cheeks.
And given her past, the victim is well known to the police.
DOA on the scene.
20-year-old female, Iris Belcher, sent major crimes to the location.
I knew her, and I actually kind of liked her.
In this profession, you learn to hate the crime and not the person.
The detectives work quickly to try and determine what happened.
When we do an investigation for a homicide, we start at the body.
And the way she was killed, 2 close-range shots to the face, it seems significant.
That gives a very personal feeling to it, perhaps indicating that the killer was someone that she knew.
Although, given the world she moved in, that doesn't rule out a drug-related murder.
Maybe it was a rival dealer or an associate that double-crossed her.
You don't see too many random killings. It's usually drug deal gone bad or, some kind of criminal activity. Tensions can certainly flare up as a result of that.
However, there are also signs that suggest a different motive.
Her legs were spread and her genitalia was exposed.
The concern was that there was a sexual assault that took place.
There were signs of a struggle. There was some furniture knocked over.
Let's check downstairs.
While the killer's motive is unclear, it's easy to see how the deadly attack progressed.
Whatever was going on started in the kitchen.
There was burnt food, which means that an attack possibly happened in the middle of getting ready for a meal.
Then, based on the blood trail, it appears Iris's attacker dragged her upstairs.
The detectives find a clump of hair on the stairs.
They thought perhaps there was an altercation that happened on the stairs.
And perhaps most tragic of all, there's a Christmas tree in the living room with gifts underneath.
I'm sure she wanted to spend Christmas with her family, and to have her life tragically cut short 5 days before Christmas was gut-wrenching.
Just as gut-wrenching as the task of telling Iris's brother that his sister is dead.
He is devastated by this loss.
And like the police, he suspects that her death could be drug-related.
I kept telling her she's gonna get herself killed.
Iris's family really pleaded with her to leave the drug dealing. They were concerned for her safety.
And the message had finally gotten through.
Iris was trying to better her life by enrolling in nursing school.
I really thought she was gonna make it out.
Whenever you have somebody who's a drug dealer and they decide to get out, you root for them. It's like the underdog, and you want them to succeed.
Instead, it looked as if Iris's turnaround had been too little, too late.
So you came over and found her?
No, it was Tyshawn, her boyfriend.
Speaking with Iris's brother, the police learned that Tyshawn was at the scene, but he left shortly thereafter.
Did he say why?
He just said he wanted to get whoever did this.
So he knew who it was?
That's what he said.
The family knew she and Tyshawn were both involved in drugs, and that possibly this could have something to do with that.
However, it's not the only possibility they have to consider.
A lot of acts of violence originate from some sort of domestic altercation between romantic partners.
And since Tyshawn was allegedly the person that found her, the detectives are going to have to rule him out.
The detectives make finding Tyshawn their first priority.
Dispatch. I need a bolo on Tyshawn Love.
They issued a bolo, and he was found pretty quickly.
Tyshawn Love was brought to the police department to be interviewed.
When questioned by the detectives, Tyshawn says that Iris had been home alone the night before her murder.
Where were you?
I went out.
Tyshawn tells detectives that he went to a bar.
And Iris's daughter was spending the night at her mother's house.
She had been spending a lot of time with her mom because of Iris's lifestyle.
Her mom, she didn't really like what we've been doing.
Selling drugs?
After the bar, Tyshant said he'd gone to a friend's place.
He said he crashed there for a few hours.
You went back to the house?
Mm-hmm.
He said that he returned home and found her body.
And he says that as soon as he saw Iris dead on the floor, he knew who did it.
Who? Lamar. Lamar Peterson. Yeah, that's him.
I knew Lamar Peterson.
He loomed large in the drug community.
And it's not hard for the detective to believe that he's their killer.
He has a very troubled past, a lot of sexual assault.
There are some people in this world that just, I can't say anything else, they perpetrate evil.
Tyshant Love has just told detectives investigating the murder of his girlfriend, Iris Fennell Belcher, that he knows who did it.
Lamar.
He said it was a fellow drug dealer named Lamar Peterson.
Lamar and Tyshant were associates from the group of New York drug dealers, but I also knew that he was very violent.
And Lamar's reputation seems like a match to Iris's murderer.
Lamar Peterson was a violent sexual offender and was a suspect in a very violent sexual assault attempted homicide in Harrisburg.
According to Tyshant, he'd also been staying with them.
You knew y'all been looking for him on that rape thing, and he wanted to stay with us for a little while until things cooled off.
Lamar was somebody that if you wanted to stay someplace, you really didn't reject him.
You don't argue with Lamar. When he says jump, you just ask how high.
He was an individual that I didn't want to confront unless I had the manpower around me to confront him.
But according to Tyshant, Iris wasn't intimidated by Lamar.
Apparently, Iris was really upset with Lamar staying there.
She just did not feel comfortable with him there, especially with their daughter.
And she did not bite her tongue in making it known her disdain towards him because of some acts he had allegedly committed.
There had been arguments between Tyshant and Iris about Lamar.
And Tyshant says that when he hesitated to kick Lamar out, Iris took matters into her own hands.
She confronted him. They had an altercation and she was really upset. She told me he had to leave.
She ever threatened him?
Yeah.
She said if he didn't go, she'd tell the police where he was. Basically turning him in for rape, which gave him no other choice but to leave.
So, according to Tyshant, Lamar had packed his things and left. But had he come back?
Tyshant says if someone hurt Iris, it was definitely Lamar.
People didn't tell him no. There was a definite amount of respect for him.
And killing Iris may have been a way for him to save face.
And the crime appears to have Lamar's MO written all over it.
She had no clothing from her waist down.
And Lamar had a history of sexual assaults.
They think that possibly Iris could be one of Lamar's victims.
But while the police consider Lamar a possible suspect, they aren't ready to let Tyshant off the hook just yet.
And how are things between you and Iris lately?
Honestly, not so great.
Tyshant tells detectives they have the same argument a lot. Iris wants better for herself and she wants out of the game. But he likes things the way they are and doesn't want to change.
When you have conflicting views and conflicting desires or purposes in life, it does bring tension to the relationship.
And Tyshant admits that last night, things got so tense, he had to get out of the house.
According to Tyshant, that's why he'd gone to the bar.
He went just to get away from the situation.
But he says that Iris showed up at the same spot just a few hours later.
Tyshant became enraged. This was opposite of everything that she said. She said she wanted to stay home, but here she was at a bar. They really got into a fight. He stormed off, but when he looked back, Iris was gone.
After that, Tyshant says he stayed at the bar to drown his sorrows.
There was a woman there, Vanessa Ortiz. They were talking, they hit it off, and she eventually invited him back to her place.
And that's where you spent the night?
Yeah, but ain't nothing happened.
Tyshawn says they just stayed on the couch and watched a movie, but he woke up the next morning and he felt incredibly guilty.
And at a little before noon, he'd headed home.
He went to go smooth things over with Iris. But when he walked into the bedroom, he saw this heinous crime.
And you had nothing to do with this?
No, sir.
He said that he loved Iris and he would never do that to her.
And when police tracked down Vanessa Ortiz, it seems Tyshawn is telling the truth.
We found out that she was with Tyshawn Love that night. Tyshawn and Vanessa had met in a bar, and she said they then went back to her house to spend the night.
While the detectives spend the next 48 hours searching for Lamar, the news of Iris's murder spreads across the city.
In the mid-90s, there was no social media presence, really. There weren't cell phones like there are today, so people would get their paper in the morning and they would watch the nightly news to see what happened.
And the details about Iris's death struck a chord with people.
There are homicides that occur in the city where not even the news picks up on them. But Iris was not that kind of homicide. It was one of those that affected a lot of people.
So there's a lot of pressure to solve this murder.
And once the detectives track down Lamar, it looks like they're on the right track.
They bring Lamar in and they realize something very interesting.
We saw that there was blood on his boots.
Detectives investigating Iris Belcher's murder have brought notorious drug dealer Lamar Peterson in for questioning.
Iris's boyfriend, Tyshawn, had previously told detectives that he believes Lamar killed Iris.
Lamar Peterson. Yeah, that's him.
And as soon as the detectives sit down with Lamar, they suspect Tyshawn may be right.
On his shoes, there's a splatter of blood. Also, he has a history of sexual assault, and Iris was found in a compromised manner that looks like it could be sexual assault.
You start to put two and two together and say, okay, is this gonna come out the floor?
When the detectives ask Lamar about Iris's murder, he denies any involvement.
Lamar says despite his troubled past, it was not him and he had nothing to do with her murder.
She didn't threaten to turn you in?
Man, she always saying stuff like that.
Detectives try to press him further, but Lamar remains silent.
He refuses to give them any more information.
But they may not need him to.
We noticed blood on your boot.
Any idea how that got there?
Lamar wouldn't talk, but because we saw that there was blood on those boots, we were able to take the boots of Lamar and we sent him to the Pennsylvania Police Lab.
After collecting his boots, detectives take Lamar into custody, but not for murder.
They hold him on the sexual assault charge that Iris supposedly threatened to turn him in on.
But detectives are still waiting for the DNA results when they get Iris's autopsy report.
The autopsy determined that she had been shot twice at extremely close range.
The first one was through the cheeks. That probably wouldn't have killed her.
Defensive wounds were indicated on her body.
She was fighting back.
And then she was killed with the one through the mouth.
However, there is one surprise in the report.
They determined there was no sexual assault.
So it's very puzzling.
Still, when the detectives get the DNA results on Lamar's boots back from the lab, they appear to be more than enough to seal his fate.
The blood that was on that boots was Iris's.
But before they charge Lamar with murder, the detectives get an unexpected tip about Vanessa Ortiz, the young woman who was Tyshawn's alibi.
According to a tipster, Vanessa had been bragging to her friends about seeing the murder take place. And Tyshawn had her hidden in a hotel so the police could not further question her.
The detectives rush to the hotel and bring Vanessa in for questioning.
She says she did spend the night with Tyshawn.
But she also tells detectives that his alibi is fake.
She said Tyshawn Love is the murderer.
Okay, so how do you know that?
Because I was there.
Vanessa tells detectives that on the morning after Tyshawn spent the night, she accompanied him back to his place.
They saw Iris cooking breakfast, and Iris was really upset that there was another woman in her home.
Who is she?
None of your business.
She and Tyshawn got into an altercation, and it became physical quickly.
What you mean none of my business? This is my house.
No, this is my house.
This is our house.
No, it's not. I pay bills here. I'm the man here.
At some point during this argument, he pulled a gun out from under the stove.
Where I'm going now, huh?
Okay, so you saw him shoot her?
No.
Vanessa claims that Tyshawn pistol whipped her.
He grabbed her by her hair, dragged her upstairs.
And then Vanessa heard gunshots coming from upstairs.
She knew that Tyshawn had shot Iris twice.
So you didn't actually see him do it?
No.
Then, according to Vanessa, Tyshawn came back downstairs and they left.
If anybody asks, I was with you last night and today. Got it? Come on.
He was desperate. He needed an alibi because he knew everything was going to point towards him, and he used her. That was just an act of desperation because a young girl like that is the last person he should have used as an alibi.
Then, after stashing Vanessa at a hotel, detectives suspect he went back home to stage the scene to further distance himself from the crime.
He went back and took off Iris's pants.
And then he pointed the finger at Lamar.
Do you have any idea who would do this?
Lamar.
Tyshawn was trying to ride the Lamar Peterson wave of violence, saying that Iris was just another one of his victims.
But there was a weak link in his plan. Vanessa.
This was overwhelming to her. There was no way she was going to hold that secret forever. There was no way she could do it.
And her story matches the physical evidence at the scene.
Vanessa's eyewitness account is enough for the detectives to take Tyshawn into custody.
We were able to get an arrest warrant.
But he continues to stick to his story.
His account was Lamar Peterson did this.
Which means there's a lot riding on Vanessa.
The government was heavily relying on her statements in order to convict Mr. Love.
And as the case moved towards trial, the prosecutors suddenly had a big problem.
Vanessa would not cooperate anymore.
As prosecutors prepare to put Iris Belcher's boyfriend, Tyshawn Love, on trial for murder, the case collapses when their star witness, Vanessa Ortiz, suddenly stops cooperating.
She got subpoenaed to the courtroom multiple times, and she was not showing up.
She had seen what happened to Iris, and she was terrified that was going to happen to her, and she didn't want to talk.
And without her testimony, the prosecution has no case.
When it went to the prelim, the charges were dropped because Vanessa wouldn't testify.
He becomes free again until such time that the government decides to refile the charges.
This news hits Iris's mother particularly hard.
She believed that it was Tyshawn who murdered her daughter, and it had to be gut-wrenching for her. It is just the worst thing ever. I mean, it's just, I can only imagine what she was going through.
When families are not able to have justice, it leaves them in a lot of emotionally distress.
But even though they've dropped the charges, Tyshawn is never entirely off the detectives' radar.
When it comes to the crime of murder, there is no statute of limitations in Pennsylvania, and so those charges can always be refiled at a date in the future.
Over time, is it that easy? No, it's not that easy.
It was assigned to other detectives. They weren't able to make headway.
But you still don't ever give up, especially if you believe that this case can eventually lead to something.
Eventually, the case ends up on the desk of Detective Donald Hefner.
I was working several homicides at the time. A couple of them were cold cases, but I felt that this was a case that could be solved. And I decided to put my efforts into it.
Sometimes you need another set of eyes to look at something from another point of view.
Even if that means starting over from the beginning.
I spoke to everybody I could. I mean, in these kind of cases, that's what you do. You kind of flip over every rock you can find to see what's underneath. And a lot of it is nothing, but sometimes it's something.
After some digging, Detective Hefner develops a sense of just how tumultuous Iris and Tyshawn's relationship had been.
Your relationship was pretty toxic.
He was painted as jealous.
Friends also said he was abusive.
On the outside, it looked like Iris and Tyshawn had a great relationship. On the inside, it wasn't so great. There was a lot of arguing, a lot of fighting, which led to sometimes physical altercations.
As time goes on, the brutality increases.
Until Iris had reached her limit.
I learned that she had told friends that she wanted to leave him.
And since she was his connection into Harrisburg's drug world, Tyshawn couldn't have that.
Iris brought him up in the social life, and without her, he was nothing.
But that's not enough to file new charges. There's still one loose end that needs tying up. Lamar Peterson.
We knew there was a problem with the case because of the blood on his boots and because of his violent behavior.
And if Tyshawn even went to trial for the murder, defense was sure to use Lamar to raise reasonable doubt.
What we couldn't verify is when that blood got on the boots. We don't know if there was another fight. We don't know if he was there when the gunshot occurred. We just don't know.
And Lamar, by this time in prison for an unrelated crime, refused to say.
I tried to close that loop, but Lamar wouldn't talk to me.
Which once again means everything is riding on Vanessa Ortiz.
Vanessa was the key.
Will she talk now that some time has passed?
I said to myself that there's a possibility that she is mature enough to talk about this, because I'm sure this has not left her alone.
And since Vanessa has become a mother in the interim, there may be a way to reach her.
You know Iris had a daughter, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes the empathetic side kicks in, and it's just messed up. This little girl has no mom. And I have information that can find this little girl some closure.
She began opening up to me, and she started to relay details of what happened at that house.
She also changes her story.
She now says that she has seen Tyshawn shoot Iris.
To get Vanessa to finally open up was a big step in trying to solve this homicide.
In September of 2001, 5 years after Iris's murder, police arrest Tyshawn for a second time. But once again, as the trial date approaches, the prosecutors are faced with a problem.
Vanessa is nowhere to be found.
Only this time, they're prepared.
They recorded her testimony, and they could use it in court.
Shortly before Tyshawn Love is scheduled to finally stand trial for the murder of Iris Fennell Belcher, the prosecution's star witness disappears a second time.
When Vanessa refused to cooperate, the first time that Tyshawn was supposed to stand trial, the prosecutors had been forced to drop the charges.
Without her testimony, there was no way to bound the case over to trial. So the case had to be dismissed.
But this time, the detectives and prosecutors are ready.
They have recorded her sworn statement.
And since it was all under oath, The prosecutors are able to use it in court when Tyshawn finally stands trial in September of 2005.
Homicide happened in 1996, so it took 9 years for prosecutors to feel like they had enough evidence to take it to trial.
In their open, the prosecutors portray Tyshawn as a vengeful boyfriend who refused to accept the end of a relationship.
Iris was getting ready to leave him. She was enrolled in school, she was trying to turn over a new leaf, and she was trying to leave the drug life behind.
She was also trying to leave her abusive boyfriend behind.
When people who have experienced domestic violence are trying to get out, those are the most dangerous times.
And when Tyshawn brought Vanessa to the home on the morning of the murder and an argument ensued, Tyshawn's anger boiled over into rage.
The gunshot wounds to the mouth, to me, indicated, shut your mouth.
But there was no way for Tyshawn to shut Vanessa up.
Her recorded testimony was the key to the prosecution's case.
They had fun the night before. You come home with a person and you witness a murder. I can't imagine that depth of trauma that could have been for her.
Still, as powerful as Vanessa's recorded statement is, the defense also has some cards to play.
There's always going to be that thought that Lamar Peterson played a part in this homicide.
The fact that there were traces of Ms. Belcher's blood on Mr. Peterson's shoe signals to the jury, hey, there could be someone else who committed this crime.
And the prosecution never came up with a compelling explanation for how Iris's blood ended up on Lamar's boot.
I honestly think that Lamar Peterson was a witness to the violence. And because he was such a violent man, he just didn't care. So he saw what happened, and he was fine with it.
But will questions about Lamar be enough for Tyshawn's acquittal?
When a verdict is read, the jury finds him guilty of third-degree murder.
In Pennsylvania, first-degree murder requires an intentional killing. There has to be premeditation. A second-degree murder, there is an underlying felony. And then third-degree murder, it's pretty much a killing with malice.
The judge sentences Tyshawn to 30 years in prison.
The system did punish Tyshawn for his violence and for taking another life, and we got closure for the family. Unfortunately, when you have these kind of homicides, or when you have a homicide investigation, we don't have justice. We have closure. In order to have justice, I have to make you kind of whole again. I can't do that. I can't bring that person back.
However, Iris's memory lives on in her daughter, now an adult with a family of her own.
To live with every day knowing that your mother was taken from you before you even had a chance to get to know her, I can only imagine what impact that's had on her.
You can adapt to it. You can learn to live with it. You can't forget it.
Despite that, Iris's daughter has created a rich life for herself.
She also realized her mom's dream, and she became a nurse.
And in that way, Iris's legacy lives on.
I remember her family talking about her as somebody who had a lot of dreams and aspirations. She had planned to better her life for herself and her child, and she was well on her way to that when her life was tragically cut short.
Interstate 5 stretches along the western edge of the United States, passing through Washington, Oregon, and California. It is a road that connects cities, businesses, neighborhoods, and ordinary daily lives. But during the final months of 1980 and the opening months of 1981, a series of robberies, sexual assaults, and murders began appearing along that corridor. At first, they looked like separate crimes. They occurred in different communities, sometimes in different states, and were investigated by different authorities. Yet slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Women working alone or in small businesses were being targeted. Robberies were followed by sexual violence. Guns were used to threaten victims, and in some cases, victims were shot and killed. The crime seemed to move with the highway itself. The person eventually associated with that pattern was Randall Brent Woodfield, a former college football player who had briefly been connected to professional football and who, years earlier, had already been convicted for violent sexual offenses and robberies. But before investigators could fully understand the scale of what was happening, there was a much more difficult question to answer. Were all of these crimes really connected to one man? The name that eventually became attached to the investigation was the I-5 killer. But the story is more complicated than the nickname suggests. Some crimes resulted in convictions. Some were later connected to Woodfield through forensic evidence. Others remain suspected connections. That distinction matters, because the number of murders attributed to Woodfield has varied considerably. Some accounts have cited 18 victims, while broader estimates have suggested 25 or even as many as 44 suspected killings. Those numbers cannot simply be treated as established fact. A suspected connection is not the same as a conviction, and a later forensic association is not the same thing as a verdict in court. To understand how the investigation reached Woodfield, it is necessary to go back before the murders, before the highway, and before the name I-5 killer existed. Randall Brent Woodfield was born in Oregon on December 26, 1950. As a young man, he became known primarily through sports. He played football at Portland State University, and in 1974, he was selected by the Green Bay Packers in the 17th round of the NFL Draft. His professional football career, however, effectively ended during training camp. He returned to Oregon, and his life soon moved in a very different direction. By 1975, police in Portland were investigating a series of attacks in which women were threatened with a knife, sexually assaulted, and robbed. Investigators eventually used a female officer as bait in an operation designed to catch the offender. Woodfield was arrested after he was found carrying marked money from one of the robberies. He admitted to the attacks described in the supplied record and referred to problems controlling his sexual urges as well as steroid use. He ultimately pleaded guilty to lesser charges and received a 10-year sentence. But he did not spend the full 10 years in prison. After serving approximately 4 years, he was released on parole in July 1979. That date would become significant when viewed against everything that followed. Woodfield had already been arrested and convicted for violent sexual behavior and robbery. Yet less than a year after his release, a new series of crimes would begin. On October 9, 1980, Sherry Lynn Ayers, 29, was attacked at her apartment in Portland. Ayers was not a stranger to Woodfield. The two had known each other since childhood, and while Woodfield was incarcerated, they had exchanged letters. 2 days after the attack, Ayers was found dead. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and stabbed repeatedly in the neck. Her family quickly thought of Woodfield and gave his name to investigators. Police questioned him, but the investigation encountered a problem that would become painfully familiar. Suspicion was not enough. At that time, investigators did not have sufficient evidence to charge him. One piece of evidence complicated the case further. The blood type associated with Woodfield did not match the blood type identified from semen in the investigation. Woodfield also refused to take a polygraph examination. Without enough evidence to prosecute, he was released. Years later, advances in DNA technology would allow investigators to connect Woodfield to some murders that had not been solved when Ayers was killed. But in 1980, those tools were not yet available to provide the answers investigators needed. Just over a month later, another double murder occurred. On November 27, 1980, Thanksgiving Day, Darcy Renee Fix, 22, and Douglas Keith Altig, 24, were killed at a house in the Portland area. Woodfield knew Fix through a friend. According to the information available in this case, He came to the house intending to attack her. Fix and Altig were then shot and killed. A .32 caliber handgun belonging to Fix disappeared from the scene. Once again, Woodfield came under investigation because of his connection to the victim. Once again, however, investigators did not have enough evidence to prosecute him. By this point, the pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. There was a previous history of sexual violence and robbery. There was Sherry Ayers, whose family had independently pointed investigators toward Woodfield. There were Fix and Altig, whose deaths again placed him within the investigators' field of attention. Yet the evidence available at the time did not provide a clear legal path forward. Then, in December, the crimes began spreading along Interstate 5 with increasing frequency. On December 9th, a gas station in Vancouver, Washington, was robbed. 4 days later, an ice cream shop in Eugene, Oregon, was robbed. The following day, a drive-in restaurant in Albany, Oregon, was attacked. On December 21st, a female restaurant employee in Seattle was restrained in a restroom and sexually assaulted while being threatened with a gun. These incidents were not identical, but together they began to form a recognizable pattern: robbery, control, sexual violence, weapons, and movement between locations connected by the same major highway. The media began referring to the unknown offender as the I-5 bandit. Investigators were also dealing with descriptions that could make identification difficult. Woodfield was associated with a yellow Volkswagen Beetle, and he sometimes used disguises or identifying features intended to obscure his appearance, including a fake beard, hooded clothing, and tape or a bandage-like material across the bridge of his nose. The highway was becoming more than a route between cities. It was becoming the geographical thread connecting crimes that had initially seemed unrelated. And as December gave way to January, the violence continued. On January 8, 1981, Woodfield was reportedly back at the same Vancouver gas station that had previously been robbed. 3 days later, a store in Eugene was robbed. On January 12th, in Sutherland, Oregon, a 20-year-old grocery store employee named Susie Benet was shot, but survived. Her survival would matter. A living victim could provide investigators with information that a murder victim could not. By this stage, the sequence seemed increasingly clear. A perpetrator moved from one location to another, often targeting women, using robbery as part of the encounter, and in many cases escalating to sexual violence and gunfire. But the most important turning point was still ahead. On January 18, 1981, in Kaiser, near Salem, Oregon, 2 young women were working at an insurance office. Their names were Sherry Hull, 20, and Beth Wilmot, 21. A man entered the building. The 2 women were restrained and sexually assaulted. Then both were shot in the back of the head. Sherry Hull died. Beth Wilmot survived. Her survival would transform the investigation. For the first time, investigators had a surviving victim who could provide information about the attacker and who would later identify Randall Woodfield in a suspect identification procedure. Yet even after Hull's murder, the series was not immediately over. The violence would continue into February, reaching California and returning to Oregon. Donna Eckerd, 37, and her 14-year-old daughter, Janelle Jarvis, were killed in Shasta County, California, on February 3rd. On February 15th, 18-year-old Julie Wrights was sexually assaulted and shot to death at her home in Beaverton, Oregon. Later, forensic evidence would connect these cases to Woodfield. But at that moment, investigators were still confronting a problem that had followed the case from its beginning. Too many crimes, too many jurisdictions, and not enough certainty. Somewhere among the scattered reports, the surviving witnesses, the physical evidence, and the growing list of locations was the path to the truth. The task was no longer simply to find a suspect. It was to determine whether the crimes were part of one pattern, and whether the man already known to investigators, Randall Woodfield, was the person moving along that pattern. The answer would begin to emerge from something deceptively ordinary: telephone bills. as investigators placed Woodfield's calls and associated locations onto a map. The points began to trace a route through San Francisco, Oregon, and Washington before turning south again. The shape resembled the path of Interstate 5 itself. What had looked like isolated crimes was beginning to look like a single investigation. And once that map took shape, the distance between suspicion and arrest began to shrink. To understand why Randall Woodfield became the focus of one of the Pacific Northwest's most difficult investigations, it is necessary to look at the years before the murders along Interstate 5. The later image of the I-5 killer can make the story seem as though it began with a mysterious stranger appearing along a highway in 1980. But Woodfield was not an unknown figure when the first murder in this series occurred. His name was already present in police records. He had already been arrested. He had already been convicted. And he had already spent years in prison for crimes involving sexual violence and robbery. That history would become increasingly important once investigators began looking backward at the crimes along I-5. Randall Brent Woodfield was born in Oregon on December 26, 1950. As a young man, he became known for football. He played at Portland State University, and in 1974, the Green Bay Packers selected him in the 17th round of the NFL Draft. For a short time, professional football offered a very different direction for his life. But that opportunity did not last. His professional career effectively ended during training camp, and Woodfield returned to Oregon. What followed was not simply a gradual descent into criminality that investigators would only discover years later. By 1975, police in Portland were already investigating a series of serious offenses involving women. The offender was described as using a knife to control his victims, sexually assaulting them, and then robbing them. The combination was important. These were not isolated property crimes, and they were not simply assaults motivated by theft. The cases involved sexual violence, threats, and robbery together. Investigators needed a way to identify the person responsible. They eventually developed an operation using a female police officer as bait. The purpose was to create an opportunity for the offender to approach and commit another crime while police could monitor the situation. Woodfield was arrested after he was found carrying marked money connected to one of the robberies. The arrest provided investigators with a suspect they could connect directly to the offenses under investigation. According to the supplied information, Woodfield admitted to the attacks and referred to difficulties controlling his sexual urges as well as steroid use. He ultimately pleaded guilty to lesser charges and received a 10-year prison sentence. That sentence, however, did not mean that he would remain behind bars for the next decade. Woodfield served approximately 4 years before being released on parole in July 1979. That release is one of the most significant dates in the chronology of the entire case. It creates a clear line between two periods of his life. Before July 1979, there was a documented history of robbery and sexual violence that had already brought him into contact with police and the courts. After July 1979, less than a year would pass before Sherry Ayers was attacked and killed in Portland. The connection does not, by itself, prove what Woodfield did during that period, but it establishes an important factual context when the later investigation began. Detectives were not dealing with a man who had never previously been associated with violent sexual offenses. They were dealing with someone whose criminal history was already known. Then came October 1980. Sherry Lynn Ayers was 29 years old. She and Woodfield had known one another since childhood, and while Woodfield was in prison, the two had exchanged letters. On October 9th, Ayers was attacked at her apartment in Portland. 2 days later, she was found dead. The supplied information states that she had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and stabbed repeatedly in the neck. For investigators, the circumstances were disturbing enough. But for Ayers' family, there was another element that immediately drew attention. Woodfield was not simply a name pulled randomly from a list of possible suspects. He was someone she knew. Her family thought of him quickly and provided his name to police. Investigators questioned Woodfield. Yet the case did not immediately produce the evidence necessary for an arrest and prosecution. One of the difficulties involved blood type evidence. The blood type associated with Woodfield did not match the blood type identified from semen in the investigation. Woodfield also refused to take a polygraph examination. In a case where investigators were trying to determine whether a person already known to them was responsible, those limitations mattered. Suspicion could direct an investigation, but suspicion alone could not establish guilt. Without sufficient evidence, Woodfield was released. The case remained unresolved. Years later, advances in DNA technology would allow investigators to connect Woodfield to some murders that had not been solved when they occurred. But in 1980, the technology available to investigators could not provide the answers that later forensic science would make possible. The investigation into Ayres's death, therefore, became an early example of a recurring problem in the Woodfield case. Investigators could have a strong reason to look at him without possessing the evidence needed to prove what they suspected. Then, on November 27, 1980, Thanksgiving Day, another double murder occurred in the Portland area. Darcy Renee Fix was 22. Douglas Keith Altig was 24. Both were killed at a house. Woodfield knew Fix through a friend. According to the supplied account, he came to the house intending to attack her. Fix and Altig were then shot and killed. A .32 caliber handgun belonging to Fix disappeared from the scene. Once again, Woodfield came under investigation because of his connection to the victim. Once again, investigators faced the same barrier. There was not enough evidence to prosecute him. The significance of these cases becomes clearer when viewed together. Sherry Ayres had been killed after knowing Woodfield for years and corresponding with him while he was incarcerated. Darcy Fix had also been known to Woodfield. In both cases, his name came into the investigation. In both cases, suspicion did not immediately translate into a prosecutable case. And then, as November became December, the nature of the crimes began to expand geographically. The robberies were no longer confined to one house or one neighborhood. On December 9, 1980, a gas station in Vancouver, Washington, was robbed. 4 days later, on December 13th, an ice cream shop in Eugene, Oregon, was robbed. The following day, December 14th, a drive-in restaurant in Albany, Oregon, was attacked. Then, on December 21st, a female restaurant employee in Seattle was restrained in a restroom and sexually assaulted while being threatened with a gun. The individual locations were different, the victims were different, and the investigations were separated by jurisdiction. Yet the crimes contained similarities. Women were being targeted. Robbery was part of the pattern. Sexual violence appeared repeatedly. Guns were being used to threaten or attack victims. And the locations were increasingly spread along the Interstate 5 corridor. Somewhere within that sequence, investigators and the media began to see something more than isolated offenses. The unknown offender became known as the I-5 bandit. The name described a criminal pattern before it described a confirmed individual. It also reflected the geography of the crimes. Interstate 5 runs through Washington, Oregon, and California, linking communities that might otherwise have had little reason to consider their investigations part of the same case. The highway provided a route between them. The person responsible, investigators would eventually conclude, could move along that route. Woodfield was associated with a yellow Volkswagen Beetle, a detail that became relevant as investigators tried to connect sightings and crimes. He was also described as using methods intended to obscure his appearance, including a fake beard, hooded clothing, and tape or a bandage-like material across the bridge of his nose. These details mattered because eyewitness descriptions can become difficult when an offender deliberately changes his appearance. The investigation was therefore facing two challenges at once. First, there was the question of identity. Second, there was the question of scope. If the crimes were connected, how many of them belonged to the same offender? And if Woodfield was responsible, how many crimes could investigators actually prove? Those questions would become more urgent in January 1981. On January 8th, Woodfield was reportedly back at the same Vancouver gas station that had previously been robbed. 3 days later, a store in Eugene was robbed. On January 12th, 20-year-old Susie Benet was working at a grocery store in Sutherland, Oregon, when she was shot. She survived. Her survival was important because a person who lived through an attack could provide investigators with information about the offender that was unavailable when the victim was killed. But the investigation was about to reach a far more consequential moment. On January 18th, in Kaiser, near Salem, Oregon, 2 young women were working at an insurance office. Sherry Hull was 20 years old. Beth Wilmot was 21. A man entered the building. Both women were restrained and sexually assaulted. Then both were shot in the back of the head. Sherry Hull died. Beth Wilmot survived. That survival would become one of the most important developments in the entire investigation. Wilmot could provide information about the attacker, and she would later identify Randall Woodfield during a suspect identification procedure. For investigators, the difference was profound. Until then, much of the case had depended upon reconstructing events after victims were unable to describe what happened. Now there was a surviving victim who could speak about the person who attacked her and Hull. Yet, even this development did not immediately bring the series to an end. On February 3rd, Donna Eckerd, 37, and her 14-year-old daughter, Janelle Jarvis, were killed in Shasta County, California. On February 15th, 18-year-old Julie Wrights was sexually assaulted and shot to death at her home in Beaverton, Oregon. These murders would later be connected to Woodfield through forensic evidence. But the investigators in early 1981 did not yet possess the complete picture that later generations would inherit. They were working with fragments, surviving witnesses, patterns of robberies, physical evidence, locations, telephone records, and the history of a man who had already been convicted of sexual violence and robbery. The question was becoming less about whether Randall Woodfield was worth investigating and more about whether the scattered evidence could be assembled into a case strong enough to withstand scrutiny. The answer would begin with a map. Investigators David Bishop and Woodfield's parole officer examined Woodfield's telephone bills. The calls connected him to locations across the West Coast. When those locations were placed together, they formed a striking geographical pattern, running through San Francisco, Oregon, and Washington before turning south again. The pattern resembled Interstate 5. The highway that had seemed to connect unrelated crimes was now becoming the framework through which investigators could understand them. The investigation was no longer moving blindly from one crime scene to another. It was beginning to move toward Randall Woodfield. And by March 1981, the distance between suspicion and arrest would become much shorter. By the beginning of March 1981, the investigation into the crimes along Interstate 5 had reached a point where individual incidents could no longer be viewed in isolation. A gas station robbery in Vancouver, an attack in Eugene, a shooting in Sutherland, a murder in Kaiser, and later killings in California and Oregon had gradually become pieces of a much larger picture. The investigators were no longer simply asking who had committed one particular robbery or murder. They were trying to determine whether the same person had moved through several jurisdictions, leaving behind a trail of violence that crossed state lines. At the center of that investigation was Randall Woodfield. The significance of the telephone records was not that a phone call, by itself, proved a murder. It was the pattern created when investigators placed Woodfield's calls and the associated locations onto a map. The points stretched through San Francisco, Oregon, and Washington, then turned south again. The resulting pattern resembled the route of Interstate 5 that did not automatically establish responsibility for every crime along the highway. But it gave investigators something they had not possessed at the beginning: a geographical framework capable of connecting cases that had previously belonged to different police departments in different communities. The importance of that distinction cannot be overstated. A serial investigation does not become stronger simply because crimes look similar. Investigators need evidence connecting the person to the individual events. In Woodfield's case, the emerging map had to be considered alongside other information. Surviving victims, relationships between Woodfield and certain victims, physical evidence, vehicle information, firearm evidence, and the pattern of robberies and sexual assaults. One of the most important developments had already occurred on January 18th, when Beth Wilmot survived the attack that killed Sherry Hull. Wilmot could provide investigators with information about the attacker and later identified Woodfield in a suspect identification procedure. Her testimony gave the investigation something that could not be obtained from the victims who had been killed, a surviving witness capable of describing and identifying the person who had attacked her. That did not mean that every other crime could automatically be attributed to Woodfield. Instead, it strengthened the case surrounding the Kaiser attack and helped investigators focus their attention on the same individual already appearing elsewhere in the investigation. The earlier cases also remained important. Sherry Ayers had known Woodfield since childhood and had exchanged letters with him while he was imprisoned. After her murder in October 1980, her family had independently given Woodfield's name to police. Yet investigators had been unable to charge him. The blood type evidence available at the time did not match the blood type associated with semen in the investigation, and Woodfield refused a polygraph examination. That case demonstrated the difference between being a logical suspect and having sufficient evidence. For prosecution, the murders of Darcy Fix and Douglas Altig presented another connection. Woodfield knew Fix through a friend, and investigators again considered him. But once more, they did not have enough evidence to prosecute. By the beginning of 1981, those earlier investigations were part of a larger pattern, but they still had to be treated according to what the evidence actually established. Meanwhile, the attacks continued. Susie Benet, 20, had been shot in Sutherland on January 12th and survived. 4 days later, Sherry Hull was killed and Beth Wilmot survived. Then came the February murders. On February 3rd, Donna Eckerd, 37, and her 14-year-old daughter, Janelle Jarvis, were killed in Shasta County, California. On February 15th, 18-year-old Julie Wrights was sexually assaulted and shot to death at her home in Beaverton, Oregon. Later, forensic evidence would connect these cases to Woodfield, but the investigators working in the first months of 1981 did not yet have the benefit of all the forensic conclusions that would emerge years later. Their immediate task was to stop the offender they believed was responsible for the continuing attacks. By March 5th, Woodfield was brought into the investigation for questioning. At this point, investigators had accumulated several different categories of information. There were the statements of surviving victims. There were the similar robberies and sexual assaults. There were the locations where Woodfield was believed to have been present. There was the yellow Volkswagen Beetle associated with him. There were telephone records showing connections to locations along the West Coast. There were identifying characteristics, including the use of a fake beard, hooded clothing, and tape or a bandage-like material across the bridge of the nose. And there was physical evidence, including firearm-related evidence. The supplied investigation records state that a search of Woodfield's residence uncovered spent .32 caliber ammunition and material resembling the tape used in the attacks. Those discoveries were important because they added physical evidence to an investigation that had previously relied heavily on patterns and associations. But again, accuracy requires caution. The presence of ammunition or similar material does not, standing alone, prove every murder investigators suspected. The significance came from the combination of evidence gathered across the investigation. A case was being built piece by piece. On March 7, 1981, Randall Woodfield was arrested. The arrest marked a major turning point, but it did not instantly resolve the entire I-5 investigation. In the days that followed, prosecutors began bringing charges in different jurisdictions. By March 16th, accusations included murder, rape, sodomy, kidnapping, armed robbery. and unlawful weapons possession. The sheer variety of charges reflected the scope of the investigation. What had started as a series of seemingly unrelated crimes had become a multi-jurisdictional case, involving several different forms of violence. Yet the existence of numerous charges also created a legal problem. Police suspicion could encompass many crimes, but a criminal trial required prosecutors to establish specific offenses with admissible evidence. Investigators might believe that one offender was responsible for a much larger series, but a jury could only convict on charges supported by the evidence presented before it. That distinction would become crucial when Woodfield eventually went to trial. The most important prosecutions centered on the January 18th attack in Kaiser, where Sherry Hull was killed and Beth Wilmot survived. Wilmot's survival gave prosecutors a central witness. She had experienced the attack herself and could identify the man she believed had assaulted her and killed Hull. The prosecution also had physical evidence to present. Among the evidence listed in the supplied information were hair, bullets, witness testimony, Wilmot's identification, and evidence related to Woodfield's other conduct. The case therefore rested on multiple forms of evidence rather than on one isolated clue. Prosecutors were attempting to demonstrate that Woodfield was the man who entered the insurance office, attacked the two women, and carried out the shooting that killed Hull. The defense, meanwhile, sought to weaken the significance of the physical evidence and challenge the prosecution's case. The trial would ultimately force the jury to make a much narrower decision than the investigators had been making during their broader inquiry. The investigators were trying to understand a suspected chain of crimes stretching across Washington, Oregon, and California. The jury, however, would have to determine whether the prosecution had proven the specific charges before it. That distinction is essential when looking at Woodfield's eventual conviction. The trial did not establish every crime that had ever been suspected of being connected to him. It established the charges for which the evidence presented was sufficient to convince the jury, beyond the required legal standard. On June 26, 1981, after approximately 3.5 hours of deliberation, the jury reached its decision. Randall Woodfield was convicted of murdering Sherry Hull, attempting to murder Beth Wilmot, and related sexual offenses. He was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 90 years. Later, in another case, he received an additional 35-year sentence for charges involving sexual assault and weapons. The Oregon Court of Appeals subsequently upheld convictions for murder, attempted murder, and 2 counts of first-degree sodomy. For the prosecution, the conviction represented a definitive legal conclusion. Woodfield was responsible for the crimes established in court. For investigators, however, the broader question remained: what about Sherry Ayers? What about Darcy Fix and Douglas Altig? What about Donna Eckert and Janelle Jarvis? What about Julie Wrights? And what about the other unsolved cases that had begun to resemble the same pattern? The answer would not arrive all at once. Some would take years. Some would depend on forensic technology that did not exist in a useful form when the original investigations were conducted. And some would remain uncertain. That is what makes the Woodfield case unusual. His arrest and conviction did not mark the end of the investigation. In many ways, they marked the beginning of a second phase. Once Woodfield was securely imprisoned, investigators could return to older cases without the immediate pressure of an active offender continuing to move along Interstate 5. As forensic science developed, evidence from old crime scenes could be reconsidered. DNA technology eventually helped establish connections that investigators in 1980 and 1981 could not make. Cases that had once stood alone could be examined again in light of what was now known about Woodfield. The process changed the historical understanding of his crimes, but it also created a new responsibility for investigators and researchers to distinguish what could be demonstrated from what could only be suspected. The legend of the I-5 killer would eventually become much larger than the conviction itself. But the legal record was narrower. Woodfield had been convicted of 1 murder in the principal trial, along with attempted murder and sexual offenses. Other murders would later be linked to him through forensic evidence. Still others would remain suspected. That difference would follow the case for decades. The investigation had begun with scattered crimes along a highway. It had progressed through witness accounts, telephone records, physical evidence, and a geographical pattern. It had ended, at least for the moment, with Woodfield behind bars. But the map investigators had created was not erased by the arrest. It remained a record of unanswered questions. And somewhere along that map were victims whose cases had yet to be fully explained. By the time Randall Woodfield stood trial for the crimes committed against Sherry Hull and Beth Wilmot, the investigation had already grown far beyond a single crime scene. For months, detectives had been trying to understand a sequence of robberies, sexual assaults, shootings, and murders that stretched through Washington, Oregon, and California. Woodfield had appeared in the background of several investigations, but suspicion alone had never been enough to establish his guilt. The January 18, 1981 attack in Kaiser was different. Sherry Hull was dead, Beth Wilmot had survived, and Wilmot could identify the man who had attacked them. That combination gave prosecutors a case that could be presented to a jury. It also meant that the trial would focus on a specific event rather than attempting to prove the entire suspected I-5 crime series at once. On January 18th, Hull and Wilmot were working at an insurance office near Salem, Oregon. Hull was 20 years old. Wilmot was 21. According to the supplied account, Woodfield entered the building, restrained both women, and sexually assaulted them. He then shot both women in the back of the head. Hull died. Wilmot survived. The survival of Wilmot became one of the most consequential developments in the investigation. A murder investigation normally begins after the victim can no longer tell investigators what happened. Detectives must reconstruct the event from physical evidence, witness accounts, circumstances surrounding the crime, and whatever traces the offender left behind. In Wilmot's case, investigators had a person who had directly experienced the attack and lived through it. She could provide information about the attacker, and she later identified Woodfield during a suspect identification procedure. Her role, therefore, went beyond that of an ordinary witness to a crime scene. Her account became a central part of the prosecution's effort to establish Woodfield's identity. But the prosecution did not rely only on her identification. The case presented to the jury included several categories of evidence. According to the supplied information, prosecutors introduced hair evidence, bullets, witness testimony, Wilmot's identification, and evidence concerning other conduct by Woodfield. Each category served a different purpose. The eyewitness evidence addressed identity. The physical evidence provided another means of connecting Woodfield to the circumstances under investigation. The evidence concerning his other conduct helped prosecutors place the alleged attack within the broader pattern that investigators had been examining. Yet the existence of a broader pattern created a potential danger as well. Investigators believed Woodfield was connected to numerous crimes, but a jury could not simply be asked to convict someone because he appeared to resemble a suspect in several other cases. The central question was whether the prosecution could prove the specific charges arising from the attack on Hull and Wilmot. This distinction between investigation and prosecution is particularly important in Woodfield's case. Police officers were looking at a much larger picture. They were examining the Vancouver robberies, the Eugene crimes, the Sutherland shooting, the earlier Portland murders, and later killings in Oregon and California. They were also examining Woodfield's history, including his previous conviction for robbery and sexual offenses. But the trial itself required a narrower approach. The prosecution had to establish Woodfield's responsibility for the crimes charged in that courtroom. The case was presented by Prosecutor Chris Van Dyke, then District Attorney of Marion County. The prosecution's position depended heavily on the convergence of evidence. Beth Wilmot had survived the attack and could identify Woodfield. The physical evidence supplied another layer of support. Hair and bullets were presented as part of the case. Other evidence connected the defendant to the broader conduct under investigation. The prosecution was therefore asking the jury to consider not one isolated fact, but the combined significance of several pieces of information. For the defense, the task was to challenge that combination. The defense sought to weaken the value of the physical evidence and undermine the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. In a criminal trial, that challenge matters because the prosecution carries the burden of proving guilt. A defendant does not have to explain every suspicious circumstance surrounding him. The prosecution must establish the charges to the required legal standard. That principle was especially significant here because Woodfield had already been associated with other investigations. His criminal history was known. His name had appeared in connection with earlier crimes. He had previously been convicted of violent sexual offenses and robbery. But those facts did not automatically prove that he had committed the murder of Sherry Hull. The jury had to consider the evidence related to the case before it. The presence of Beth Wilmot as a surviving victim gave the prosecution a particularly important form of evidence. She had not merely heard about the offender from someone else. She had personally encountered the attacker. Her identification of Woodfield became one of the key components of the state's case. At the same time, the prosecution presented physical evidence intended to reinforce the identification. This combination mattered because the investigation had previously demonstrated how difficult it could be to move from suspicion to prosecution. After Sherry Ayers was killed in October 1980, her family had immediately thought of Woodfield and provided his name to investigators. Police questioned him, but the available evidence did not allow them to charge him. The blood type evidence did not match. Woodfield refused a polygraph, and he was released. After Darcy Fix and Douglas Altig were killed in November, investigators again considered Woodfield, but once again they lacked sufficient evidence to prosecute him. The Hull and Wilmot case represented a significant change. This time, investigators had a surviving victim who could identify the accused, along with physical evidence presented by the prosecution. The case therefore moved beyond suspicion. It moved into the courtroom. The trial also illustrated another recurring problem in the investigation: the difference between what investigators suspected and what they could legally prove. By this point, Woodfield was suspected of being connected to a much larger series of crimes. The media had already adopted the name I-5 Bandit, and the later label I-5 Killer would become attached to the broader case. But the jury was not being asked to decide whether Woodfield was responsible for every crime along Interstate 5. It was being asked to decide whether he was responsible for the charges arising from the Kaiser attack. That distinction would remain important long after the trial ended. The prosecution's evidence was ultimately persuasive. On June 26, 1981, after approximately 3.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Randall Woodfield was found guilty of murdering Sherry Hull, attempting to murder Beth Wilmot, and related sexual offenses. The verdict established his legal responsibility for those crimes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 90 years. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the offenses and ensured that the conviction would have consequences extending far beyond the courtroom. But the legal process did not stop there. In another case, Woodfield later received an additional 35-year sentence for charges involving sexual assault and weapons. The Oregon Court of Appeals subsequently upheld the convictions for murder, attempted murder, and 2 counts of first-degree sodomy. For the prosecution, the conviction was a major achievement. A man who had been under suspicion in multiple investigations was now legally established as the murderer of Sherry Hull and the attempted murderer of Beth Wilmot. Yet the verdict did not answer every question surrounding the larger I-5 investigation. It did not establish what had happened to Sherry Ayers. It did not, by itself, determine responsibility for the deaths of Darcy Fix and Douglas Altig. It did not resolve the killings of Donna Eckert and Janelle Jarvis or the murder of Julie Wrights. Those cases would require their own evidence and, in some instances, would only be connected to Woodfield years later through advances in forensic science. This is where the Woodfield story becomes more complicated than a conventional serial murder. Prosecution. The courtroom produced certainty about a limited set of crimes. The wider investigation contained a much larger field of possibilities. For victims' families, that distinction could be deeply significant. A conviction could answer who was responsible for one murder, while leaving other families waiting for answers about their own loved ones. The name I-5 Killer could suggest that investigators had solved an entire series, but the legal record was more precise. Woodfield had been convicted of one murder in the principal trial, along with attempted murder and sexual offenses. Other cases would later be connected through forensic evidence. Still others would remain matters of suspicion. The trial, therefore, marked both an ending and a beginning. It ended the immediate question of whether Woodfield could be convicted for the Kaiser attack. The jury had answered that question, but it began another stage of the investigation, determining how many other crimes could legitimately be connected to him. As Woodfield entered a life of incarceration, investigators continued to examine the evidence left behind in older cases. Technology would eventually change what that evidence could reveal. DNA testing would provide connections that investigators in 1980 and 1981 could not establish. Old crime scenes could be revisited. Evidence that once seemed inconclusive could be examined with methods unavailable at the time. And slowly, the story of Woodfield would expand beyond the conviction that first placed him behind bars. But that later expansion would require the same caution that had been necessary from the beginning. A connection had to be demonstrated, a suspicion had to remain a suspicion, and a conviction had to be understood for exactly what it established. Sherry Hull's death was proven in court. Beth Wilmot survived and helped make that prosecution possible. The verdict gave the investigation its first definitive legal conclusion. Yet the map of Interstate 5 still contained unanswered cases, and the question of Woodfield's full involvement had only begun to unfold. The conviction of Randall Woodfield in 1981 created a clear legal fact, but it did not create a complete explanation for everything that had happened along Interstate 5. Woodfield had been convicted of murdering Sherry Hull, attempting to murder Beth Wilmot, and committing related sexual offenses. He had received a sentence of life imprisonment plus 90 years, and later received an additional 35-year sentence in another case involving sexual assault and weapons. The Oregon Court of Appeals upheld the convictions for murder, attempted murder, and 2 counts of first-degree sodomy. From a legal standpoint, the central question in the Hull and Wilmot case had been answered. But investigators were left with a much larger question. How many other crimes could legitimately be connected to the man now serving a life sentence? That question mattered because Woodfield's name had appeared repeatedly before his arrest. Sherry Lynn Ayers had been killed in Portland on October 9, 1980. Darcy Fix and Douglas Altig had been killed in the Portland area on November 27. A series of robberies and sexual assaults had followed along Interstate 5. Donna Eckert and her 14-year-old daughter, Janelle Jarvis, were killed in Shasta County, California, on February 3, 1981. Julie Wrights, 18, was sexually assaulted and shot to death at her home in Beaverton on February 15. These were not simply names on a list. Each represented a separate investigation, a separate victim, and a separate unanswered question. The conviction in the Hull case could not automatically resolve all of them. That distinction became even more important as investigators returned to older evidence. In 1981, forensic science had limitations that would become increasingly obvious with time. Evidence that could not conclusively identify a perpetrator in 1980 or 1981 might later become useful when DNA technology advanced. This meant that Woodfield's arrest did not necessarily close the files. Instead, some of them remained open in a different form. Investigators could preserve evidence, revisit earlier findings, and examine whether new scientific techniques could establish connections that had previously been impossible to prove. Sherry Ayers' murder illustrates the difficulty of the earlier investigation. Ayers had known Woodfield since childhood. The two had exchanged letters while he was in prison. When she was killed, her family immediately thought of him and gave his name to police. Woodfield was questioned, but investigators did not have sufficient evidence to charge him. One piece of evidence available at the time appeared to work against the theory that he was the offender. The blood type associated with Woodfield did not match the blood type identified from semen in the investigation. Woodfield also refused a polygraph examination. Without stronger evidence, police had to release him. Years later, advances in DNA technology would change the way investigators could examine such evidence. A case that once depended on blood typing and circumstantial associations could be reconsidered, using a far more discriminating forensic method. The same broader principle applied to other cases associated with Woodfield. The 1980 murder of Darcy Fix and the killing of Douglas Altig had already attracted investigators' attention because Woodfield knew Fix through a friend. According to the supplied information, he came to the house intending to attack Fix, and both Fix and Altig were shot and killed. A .32 caliber handgun belonging to Fix disappeared from the scene. Yet despite Woodfield's connection to Fix, police did not initially possess enough evidence to prosecute him. The case therefore remained separate from the conviction obtained in the Hull murder. The later development of forensic links was significant precisely because it could provide evidence that investigators did not have at the time. This pattern repeated itself with other cases. Donna Eckerd, 37, and her 14-year-old daughter, Janelle Jarvis, 14, were killed in Shasta County, California, on February 3, 1981. Their deaths occurred during the same period in which the crimes associated with Woodfield were spreading through the Pacific Northwest and California. But chronology alone could not establish responsibility. The later forensic association with Woodfield was therefore important. It moved the case beyond simply saying that the murders occurred during the same period and toward an evidentiary connection. Julie Wright's was another case that later became associated with Woodfield through forensic evidence. She was 18 years old when she was sexually assaulted and shot to death at her home in Beaverton on February 15, 1981. At the time, investigators were confronting an active series of violent crimes. By the time Woodfield had been arrested and convicted, however, the larger question remained unresolved. The later forensic connection helped investigators place Wright's death within the broader Woodfield investigation. Yet even here, the distinction between a forensic connection and a courtroom conviction remained important. A forensic link could establish that evidence from a crime was associated with Woodfield. It did not automatically mean that every circumstance of the crime had been reconstructed in court, or that Woodfield had personally provided an explanation for what happened. And Woodfield never supplied that explanation himself. He did not confess to the murders attributed to him. He never provided investigators with a complete account of the crimes they suspected him of committing. This left the historical record dependent upon evidence gathered by investigators rather than on a confession from the man at its center. That absence of a confession created a lasting uncertainty around the total number of victims. Different sources have produced different estimates. Some accounts have cited 18 victims. Other investigators and researchers have suggested that Woodfield may have been responsible for 25 or even as many as 44 killings. But the highest figure represents suspected connections, not 44 murder convictions. That distinction is essential. A case may contain similarities in victim profile, geography, method, timing, or other circumstances without those similarities being sufficient to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The larger the number becomes, the more important that distinction is. If a podcast simply states that Woodfield killed 44 people, it converts a broad investigative suspicion into a definitive fact. The available information does not justify that claim. A more accurate description is that Woodfield was convicted of one murder in the principal trial, while multiple other murders were later linked to him, with the total number of suspected victims remaining disputed. This difference between confirmed and suspected crimes is not merely a technical issue. It changes how the victims' stories are remembered. When a case becomes associated with a famous nickname, individual people can disappear behind the reputation of the offender. The phrase, I-5 killer, can make the story sound like a single enormous crime rather than a collection of separate tragedies. But each case involved people with their own lives, families, relationships, and futures. Sherry Ayers was 29. Darcy Fix was 22. Douglas Altig was 24. Donna Eckerd was 37. Janelle Jarvis was 14. Julie Wrights was 18. Sherry Hull was 20. Beth Wilmot was 21 and survived. Susie Benet was 20 and survived after being shot. Their cases should not be reduced simply to numbers attached to a criminal nickname. The surviving victims were especially important because their testimony and experiences helped investigators understand the offender. Beth Wilmot's survival, in particular, became central to the successful prosecution of the Hull murder. Susie Benet's survival also provided investigators with a victim who could live beyond the attack. In a case involving multiple murders, survival can provide an investigative bridge between crime scene and courtroom. It can give investigators information that would otherwise be lost. The later forensic connections also demonstrate how investigations can change over time. When a crime occurs, investigators can only use the technology available to them. Evidence may be collected and preserved even when its full value is not immediately apparent. Years later, scientific developments can allow investigators to return to that evidence and ask new questions. In Woodfield's case, DNA technology eventually provided links to some murders that could not be established when the crimes originally occurred. That development did not rewrite the past, but it changed what investigators could demonstrate about it. It also helped explain why the investigation continued long after Woodfield had entered prison. The original arrest had stopped one suspected offender from continuing his movement along Interstate 5, but it had not answered every question left by the cases behind him. The map that investigators had assembled from telephone records and crime locations remained significant. It showed how the suspected offender's movements appeared to correspond with a series of crimes across Washington, Oregon, and California. But the map alone was never enough. It had to be supported by evidence specific to individual cases. That is why the later forensic developments mattered so much. They could transform a geographical or behavioral pattern into a more concrete evidentiary connection. Still, even with those developments, uncertainty remained. There were cases that investigators suspected might belong to Woodfield, but could not conclusively establish. There were possible victims whose cases could not be definitively attributed to him. There were questions about how many crimes had actually been committed by the same offender. And there was no confession from Woodfield to provide a final accounting. This is ultimately one of the defining features of the case. The conviction provided certainty, but only within a defined legal boundary. The later forensic evidence expanded the known scope, but did not necessarily eliminate every uncertainty. The disputed victim counts remained a reminder that the investigation had limits. Woodfield could be placed beyond reasonable doubt in certain crimes, linked through forensic evidence to others, and suspected in still more. Those categories should remain separate. For a true crime account, that distinction is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. The case demonstrates how investigators can spend years assembling fragments, how technology can change the meaning of evidence, and how a conviction can coexist with unanswered questions. Randall Woodfield went to prison in 1981, but the investigation surrounding his name did not end there. The files remained. The evidence remained. And for the families of victims whose cases were not resolved in the courtroom, The search for certainty continued long after the highway itself had fallen silent. The arrest of Randall Woodfield in March 1981 had given investigators something they had been searching for since the crimes along Interstate 5 began to accumulate. A suspect they could place at the center of the investigation. But an arrest was not the same thing as an explanation. Woodfield had been convicted for the murder of Sherry Hull, the attempted murder of Beth Wilmot, and related sexual offenses. He had received a life sentence plus 90 years, followed by another 35-year sentence in a separate case. Yet the larger collection of unsolved murders and assaults connected to the I-5 investigation remained. For investigators, the challenge now changed. Before the arrest, the priority had been identifying and stopping the offender. After the conviction, the question became retrospective. Could the evidence preserved from earlier crime scenes establish whether Woodfield had been responsible for other victims? The answer would emerge slowly, over years rather than months. The technology available in 1980 and 1981 placed clear limits on what investigators could prove. Evidence that seemed inconclusive at the time could later become valuable when forensic science advanced. This was particularly important in cases such as the murder of Sherry Ayres. When Ayres was killed in Portland on October 9, 1980, Woodfield immediately came under suspicion. He had known her since childhood, and they had exchanged letters while he was incarcerated. Her family gave his name to police, yet investigators could not build a prosecutable case. Woodfield was questioned and released. One of the problems involved blood type evidence. The blood type associated with Woodfield did not match the blood type identified from semen in the investigation. He also refused to take a polygraph examination. At the time, these facts contributed to the inability to charge him. But forensic science would not remain static. Years later, DNA technology allowed investigators to examine biological evidence with a level of discrimination that earlier blood typing methods could not provide. The significance of DNA in the Woodfield investigation was therefore not simply that it produced new evidence. It changed the evidentiary possibilities of old evidence. A sample collected during an investigation could remain in storage even when investigators had been unable to identify its source conclusively. Decades later, the same material could potentially be tested using methods unavailable to the original investigators. In Woodfield's case, this development helped connect him to murders that had not been solved when they occurred. The result was a gradual expansion of the known case. But that expansion had to be treated carefully. A later forensic connection did not mean that Woodfield had been convicted of every crime associated with his name. It meant that evidence from a particular case could be linked to him. The legal significance of that connection depended on the individual circumstances and the evidence available. This distinction is especially important when considering the murders of Darcy Fix and Douglas Altig. They were killed in the Portland area on November 27, 1980. Woodfield knew Fix through a friend, and investigators had already considered him because of that relationship. According to the supplied information, Woodfield came to the house intending to attack Fix, and both Fix and Altig were shot and killed. Fix's .32 caliber handgun disappeared from the scene. Despite the suspicions surrounding Woodfield, police did not have enough evidence at the time to prosecute him. That case therefore remained outside the principal conviction that put him in prison. The same pattern appeared in other investigations. The crimes that had once seemed like separate incidents could now be reviewed with knowledge of Woodfield's established criminal history and the evidence developed in the Hull and Wilmot case. But investigators still had to distinguish between a pattern and proof. A similar method of attack, a location near Interstate 5, or the fact that Woodfield was known to have been in the area might strengthen a theory, but none of those facts alone could establish that he committed a particular murder. This is why the later forensic developments were so significant. They provided evidence that could be connected to individual victims rather than simply to the general pattern. Donna Eckert and her 14-year-old daughter, Janelle Jarvis, were killed in Shasta County, California, on February 3, 1981. Their deaths occurred during the same period as the broader series of crimes. Later, forensic evidence connected the killings to Woodfield. That connection expanded the understanding of his suspected activity beyond Oregon and into California. It also reinforced one of the defining features of the investigation: geography. Interstate 5 had never been simply a background detail. It was the corridor through which many of the crimes had occurred, and telephone records had helped investigators identify a pattern in Woodfield's movements between Washington, Oregon, and California. The later forensic connections strengthened the idea that the geographical pattern represented more than coincidence. Yet the cases still remained individual tragedies, each requiring its own evidence. Julie Wright's was another example. She was 18 when she was sexually assaulted and shot to death at her home in Beaverton on February 15, 1981. Her death came only weeks after the killing of Sherry Hull and the shooting of Beth Wilmot. Later forensic evidence connected Wright's murder to Woodfield. For investigators, that kind of connection could answer a question that had remained unresolved since 1981. For the family of a victim, however, the significance was more personal. A forensic connection could finally identify the person associated with a crime that had remained unexplained for years. It could transform a case from an unsolved homicide into one connected to a known offender. But even as more cases were associated with Woodfield, one question became increasingly difficult to answer: exactly how many victims were there? The number has never been as simple as a single figure. Some sources have cited 18 victims. Other investigators or researchers have suggested that Woodfield may have been responsible for 25 or even 44 killings. But the higher numbers include suspected cases. They cannot be presented as though Woodfield had been convicted of 44 murders. He was not. His principal conviction established one murder: the killing of Sherry Hull. He was also convicted of attempting to kill Beth Wilmot and of related sexual offenses. Other cases were later connected through forensic evidence. Still others remain suspected. The difference between these categories is fundamental. Convicted means a court found him guilty of a specific offense. Forensically linked means evidence from another case was connected to him through scientific examination. Suspected means investigators or researchers believed there was a possible connection, but the available evidence did not establish the same level of certainty. A responsible account of the Woodfield case has to preserve those distinctions. Otherwise, the investigation becomes distorted by the reputation that developed around the I-5 killer label. The nickname is memorable, but it can also flatten a complicated investigation into a single statement: one man, one highway, dozens of murders. The actual evidence is more complicated. The legal record is narrower, and the victims deserve more precision than a dramatic number can provide. Another important feature of the case is that Woodfield never supplied a complete confession. He did not provide investigators with a detailed account of the murders attributed to him. There was no final statement in which he explained where he had gone, what he had done, or which crimes belonged to him. Investigators therefore had to reconstruct the case through evidence rather than through his own narrative. This absence of confession left certain questions permanently open. If Woodfield had been responsible for additional crimes that could never be conclusively linked to him, there would be no statement from him to resolve them. The uncertainty could therefore survive even as the forensic record became stronger. That uncertainty also explains why the investigation remained relevant long after Woodfield entered prison. The arrest had removed him from the streets, but it did not remove the unanswered questions from the case files. Old evidence could be re-examined. DNA could be tested. Records could be compared. Investigators could revisit crimes that had once appeared unrelated. The passage of time itself became part of the investigation. What could not be proven in 1981 might become demonstrable years later. This is one of the most important lessons of the Woodfield case. A criminal investigation does not always move in a straight line from crime to arrest to conviction. Sometimes evidence survives longer than the technology that first examined it. Sometimes a case has to wait for science to catch up. And sometimes even new technology cannot answer every question. In Woodfield's case, DNA and later forensic methods expanded the number of crimes that could be associated with him. But they did not create a complete inventory of everything he may have done. The result is a case divided into layers of certainty. At the center is the conviction. Sherry Hull was murdered, Beth Wilmot survived an attempted murder, and Woodfield was found legally responsible for those crimes. Around that center are cases later connected through forensic evidence, including murders such as those of Donna Eckerd, Janelle Jarvis, and Julie Wrights. Beyond those are other cases investigators suspected might belong to the same offender. The boundaries between these categories are where much of the historical debate remains. But behind all of them are individual victims whose lives cannot be reduced to the eventual reputation of their alleged killer. The purpose of revisiting the evidence is not to enlarge the legend surrounding Woodfield. It is to clarify what investigators knew, what they later discovered, and what they could never establish with certainty. In that sense, the evidence that survived the decades became more than a tool for identifying a suspect. It became a way of preserving the stories of victims whose cases might otherwise have remained unresolved. The highway had connected the crimes geographically. The investigation had connected them through patterns and evidence. And forensic science, years later, would connect some of them to the same man. But even after those connections were made, one final boundary remained: the difference between what could be proven and what could only be believed. For the families still living with unanswered questions, that boundary was not an academic distinction. It was the line between knowing what happened and wondering forever. By the time Randall Woodfield became known as the I-5 killer, the nickname had begun to overshadow the individual cases that created it. A highway can be drawn as a single line across a map, and a criminal investigation can be organized around that same line. But the lives affected by the crimes cannot be reduced to geography. Interstate 5 connected Washington, Oregon, and California. Yet each location represented a different community, and each crime represented a different victim. Some victims were killed. Others survived. Some knew Woodfield before their attacks. Others appear to have encountered him only because their work or circumstances placed them in his path. Looking at those victims individually is essential because the scale of the investigation can otherwise make their stories disappear behind the name of the offender. Sherry Lynn Ayers was 29 years old when she was killed in Portland on October 9, 1980. Her connection to Woodfield was especially disturbing because he was not a complete stranger. The two had known each other since childhood, and they had exchanged letters while Woodfield was serving his earlier prison sentence. When Ayers was attacked in her apartment, that history immediately became relevant to investigators. Her family thought of Woodfield and provided his name to police. 2 days after the attack, Ayers was found dead. The supplied information states that she had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and stabbed repeatedly in the neck. Her death became one of the earliest murders later associated with Woodfield. But at the time, investigators could not establish his guilt. Woodfield was questioned, yet the evidence available did not support prosecution. The blood type identified from semen at the scene did not match Woodfield's blood type, and he refused a polygraph examination. He was released. For Ayers' family, the absence of an immediate arrest could not change what had already happened. It could only leave the central question unanswered: who had killed her? That question would remain part of the larger Woodfield investigation as additional crimes emerged. Less than 2 months later, on November 27th, another pair of victims were killed. Darcy Renee Fix was 22. Douglas Keith Altig was 24. Their deaths occurred in the Portland area, and the circumstances again brought Woodfield into the investigation. Woodfield knew Fix through a friend. According to the supplied account, He arrived at the house intending to attack her. Fix and Altig were both shot and killed. A .32 caliber handgun belonging to Fix disappeared from the scene. Their deaths were significant because the investigation was beginning to reveal a recurring pattern involving sexual violence, robbery, and firearms, but there was still no sufficient evidence to prosecute Woodfield for the killings at that time. Once again, the name of a potential suspect appeared in an investigation, yet the legal threshold remained out of reach. The cases that followed demonstrated how rapidly the violence was spreading geographically. On December 9, 1980, a gas station in Vancouver, Washington, was robbed. 4 days later, an ice cream shop in Eugene, Oregon, was robbed. The following day, a drive-in restaurant in Albany was attacked. On December 21st, a female restaurant employee in Seattle was restrained in a restroom and sexually assaulted while being threatened with a gun. These victims were part of the wider pattern that caused investigators to begin thinking beyond individual crimes. The offender was not simply attacking people in one neighborhood. The crimes were appearing at different points along Interstate 5. The media eventually began referring to the unknown offender as the I-5 bandit. The name reflected the geography, but it also concealed the human reality of the crimes. Each robbery meant another person had been threatened. Each sexual assault meant another victim had been subjected to violence. The investigation was becoming a regional problem, but the suffering remained personal. In January 1981, the attacks continued. On January 12th, 20-year-old Susie Benet was shot at a grocery store in Sutherland, Oregon. Unlike many victims in the series, Benet survived. Her survival was significant because it meant that investigators could obtain information from someone who had directly encountered the attacker. A surviving victim can provide details that no crime scene can fully reproduce. She can describe what happened, what the offender looked like, and what actions he took. But survival does not mean that the experience becomes less serious. A victim who lives through an attack must carry the consequences of that violence after the offender has disappeared. In the Woodfield investigation, surviving victims became an important bridge between the crimes and the eventual prosecution. 6 days after Benet was shot, the investigation reached its most important turning point. On January 18, 1981, Sherry Hull and Beth Wilmot were working at an insurance office near Salem, Oregon. Hull was 20 years old. Wilmot was 21. Their ages are easy to read as statistics, but they are important precisely because they remind us how young the two women were. They were working when the attack occurred. Woodfield entered the building, restrained both women, and sexually assaulted them. He then shot both in the back of the head. Hull died. Wilmot survived. Her survival changed the investigation. Wilmot could identify the attacker, and she later identified Woodfield during a suspect identification procedure. The testimony of a surviving victim was different from circumstantial information gathered from a telephone record or a crime scene. Wilmot could speak directly about the person who had attacked her and Hull. Her evidence became central to the prosecution that eventually convicted Woodfield of Hull's murder and the attempted murder of Wilmot. But the attack had also left behind another kind of evidence: the fact that Hull's family would never see her again. In the legal record, she became the murder victim whose death formed the central charge against Woodfield. In human terms, she was a 20-year-old woman whose life ended in an office where she had been working. The distinction matters. A prosecution must reduce an event into charges and evidence. Remembering the victim requires restoring what the legal process necessarily leaves out. After the Kaiser attack, the violence did not immediately stop. On February 3rd, Donna Eckerd, 37, and her 14-year-old daughter, Janelle Jarvis, were killed in Shasta County, California. Their deaths expanded the geographical reach of the investigation. California was not merely a distant location appearing on a map. It was where another mother and daughter lost their lives. Later forensic evidence connected the killings to Woodfield. But the fact that the connection was established later is important. At the time of their deaths, investigators did not possess the complete forensic picture that would eventually become available. Their case illustrates how the passage of time can change an investigation. Evidence that could not conclusively identify a perpetrator in 1981 could later become part of a forensic connection. The same was true for 18-year-old Julie Wrights. On February 15, 1981, she was sexually assaulted and shot to death at her home in Beaverton, Oregon. She was 18. Her murder occurred less than a month after Hull's death, and during the final phase of the investigation that would lead to Woodfield's arrest. Later forensic evidence connected her death to Woodfield. The connection helped expand the known scope of the case, but it also underscored the importance of separating what was established at trial from what investigators determined later. The victims whose cases were eventually linked through forensic evidence did not receive the same immediate legal resolution as Sherry Hull. Some families waited years before science provided a stronger answer. Others faced the possibility that their cases might never be completely explained. And some suspected cases remained unresolved even after Woodfield was imprisoned. That uncertainty is one of the most difficult aspects of the investigation. The public story can create the impression that once Woodfield was arrested, the entire series had been solved. It had not. His arrest stopped his freedom, but it did not automatically establish responsibility for every unsolved crime along the I-5 corridor. The later forensic investigations were therefore important not only because they strengthened the case against Woodfield, but because they gave investigators an opportunity to revisit the lives and deaths of people whose cases had remained open. Yet even the later evidence had limits. Some sources have cited 18 victims, while other estimates have suggested 25 or as many as 44. The largest numbers represent suspected connections rather than convictions. It is therefore impossible to treat every name in the broader list as equally established. A careful account has to say which cases were proven in court, which were later connected by forensic evidence, and which remain suspected. That distinction protects the integrity of the victims' stories. It prevents uncertainty from being turned into false certainty simply because the larger number makes the story more dramatic. The victims themselves did not need a dramatic number to make their deaths significant. Sherry Ayers was significant because she was Sherry Ayers. Darcy Fix and Douglas Altig were significant because they were Darcy and Douglas. Donna Eckert and Janelle Jarvis were mother and daughter. Julie Wrights was 18. Sherry Hull was 20. Beth Wilmot was 21 and survived. Susie Benet was 20 and survived. Their experiences formed the human reality behind the investigative map. The highway was the connecting geography, but it was not the story. The story was what happened to people along that route and how investigators attempted to give those cases meaning after the violence had occurred. In the years that followed, Randall Woodfield remained in prison. The nickname continued to circulate. The number of suspected victims continued to be debated. New forensic techniques added connections to the historical record. But none of those developments changed the central fact that the investigation began with individual victims, each with a separate life and a separate case. Their stories were eventually gathered into one investigation because evidence suggested a common offender. But they should still be remembered separately. The most important legacy of the case is therefore not the reputation of the man who became known as the I-5 killer. It is the continuing effort to distinguish truth from assumption and to ensure that the victims are not forgotten simply because their killer became famous. By the time Randall Woodfield had been imprisoned, the immediate threat represented by his movement along Interstate 5 had ended. But the investigation itself had not reached a simple conclusion. Woodfield had been convicted of murdering Sherry Hull, attempting to murder Beth Wilmot, and committing related sexual offenses. He had received a life sentence plus 90 years, and later received an additional 35-year sentence in another case involving sexual assault and weapons. Yet the larger investigation continued because Woodfield's name had become associated with a number of other murders and attacks that had occurred before his arrest. The challenge was no longer simply to identify a suspect. Investigators had to determine which cases could actually be connected to him and which could not. This distinction became increasingly important as new forensic techniques allowed investigators to revisit evidence collected years earlier. In the original investigations, detectives had worked with the technology available at the time. Blood typing, witness statements, physical evidence, telephone records, and other investigative methods could establish some facts, but they could not always provide the level of certainty investigators needed. DNA technology later changed that. Evidence preserved from older crime scenes could be examined again, and in some cases it provided a forensic connection to Woodfield. The effect was significant. A case that had once been treated as an unsolved homicide could now be associated with a known offender. But even that development did not mean that every unsolved murder connected to the I-5 pattern could automatically be attributed to him. The distinction between a forensic link and a criminal conviction remained essential. One of the earliest cases to illustrate this problem was the murder of Sherry Ayres. Ayres was 29 when she was killed in Portland on October 9, 1980. She had known Woodfield since childhood, and the two had exchanged letters while he was incarcerated. Her family thought of him immediately after her death and gave his name to investigators. Woodfield was questioned, but police did not have enough evidence to prosecute him. The available blood type evidence did not match the blood type associated with semen in the investigation, and Woodfield refused a polygraph examination. At that moment, the case remained unresolved. Years later, improvements in DNA testing changed the evidentiary landscape. Biological evidence could be examined with far greater precision than the earlier methods had allowed. The later forensic developments helped investigators associate Woodfield with several murders, demonstrating how an old case could acquire new significance decades after the crime. The same principle applied to the November 27, 1980 killings of Darcy Fix and Douglas Altig. Fix was 22, Altig 24. Woodfield knew Fix through a friend, and investigators had considered him because of that relationship. According to the supplied account, he came to the house intending to attack Fix, and both victims were shot. Fix's .32 caliber handgun disappeared from the scene. Yet the original investigation did not produce sufficient evidence to prosecute Woodfield. His presence in the investigative picture was not enough. A relationship with the victim was not enough. Suspicion was not enough. The case therefore remained separate from the conviction obtained for the murder of Sherry Hull. Later forensic evidence helped connect the killings to Woodfield, giving investigators a stronger basis for including them within the broader case. This progression, from suspicion to investigation to later forensic connection, occurred in other cases as well. Donna Eckert and her 14-year-old daughter, Janelle Jarvis, were killed in Shasta County, California, on February 3, 1981. Their deaths occurred during the same period in which the I-5 crimes were unfolding. Their location also demonstrated how widely the suspected offender had traveled. California was part of the same geographical corridor that investigators had already begun mapping through telephone records and other information. But geography alone could not establish guilt. The later forensic connection was therefore important because it provided evidence specific to the case rather than merely relying on the fact that the murders occurred along the same broad route. Julie Wrights was another victim whose case was later connected through forensic evidence. She was 18 when she was sexually assaulted and shot to death at her home in Beaverton on February 15, 1981. Her murder occurred shortly before Woodfield's arrest on March 7th. At the time, investigators were dealing with an active offender and a rapidly expanding investigation. Years later, forensic evidence helped connect Wrights' murder to Woodfield. That connection strengthened the understanding of the crimes associated with him, but it also demonstrated why the historical record has to be divided into different levels of certainty. Some crimes were established in court. Some were connected later through forensic evidence. Others remained possible or suspected. These categories should never be treated as interchangeable. The temptation to combine them is understandable. A case involving a notorious serial offender seems to invite a single final number. Some sources have cited 18 victims. Others have suggested 25 or even 44 murders. The largest figure is particularly striking, but it must be understood correctly. It represents a broad estimate of suspected responsibility, not 44 murder convictions. Woodfield was not convicted of 44 murders. In the principal trial, he was convicted of murdering Sherry Hull. He was also convicted of attempting to murder Beth Wilmot and of related sexual offenses. Other cases were later connected through forensic evidence. Still more were suspected. A responsible account, therefore, cannot simply state that Woodfield killed 44 people. The evidence does not support presenting that figure as an established fact. Instead, the most accurate description is that Woodfield was convicted of one murder while multiple other killings were later linked to him, and the total number of victims potentially attributable to him remains disputed. This distinction also reveals something important about the nature of criminal investigations. A conviction is not the same as a theory. Investigators can develop a theory that one person is responsible for a series of crimes, but that theory must be tested against evidence. When the evidence is insufficient, a suspect can remain free even if investigators strongly believe that person is responsible. This happened repeatedly in Woodfield's case before his arrest. After Ayers was killed, his name came up. After Fix and Altig were killed, his name came up again. Yet investigators did not have enough evidence to charge him with those murders at the time. The investigation eventually changed because the evidence accumulated. Surviving victims could provide identification information. Physical evidence could be examined. Telephone records help reveal a pattern of movement. The attack on Hull and Wilmot provided a surviving eyewitness and evidence strong enough to support a prosecution. And later forensic technology added connections that investigators could not establish in 1981. The story therefore demonstrates how different types of evidence can interact without becoming identical. A telephone record might place a person near a particular location. A witness might identify the person who committed an attack. A bullet might connect a weapon to a crime. Biological evidence might establish a forensic association. Each piece answers a different question. Together, they can create a stronger case. But they must still be interpreted within their proper limits. There is another unanswered question that has remained throughout the Woodfield case. How many crimes were never discovered or never successfully connected to him? Because Woodfield never confessed to the murders attributed to him, there is no complete account from the offender himself. Investigators therefore cannot simply ask him to identify every victim and every crime. The absence of a confession means that the historical record must remain evidence-based. Where evidence establishes a connection, it can be stated. Where investigators only suspect a connection, that uncertainty must remain visible. And where no reliable connection exists, the crime should not be absorbed into the Woodfield narrative simply because the circumstances appear similar. This is especially important for victims whose cases remain unresolved. A famous suspect can sometimes become a magnet for unsolved crimes. Once a person is believed to be responsible for a large series, investigators and researchers may naturally examine other cases for similarities. Some connections will prove genuine, others will not. The danger is that the reputation of the suspect can begin to substitute for evidence. In Woodfield's case, the later forensic discoveries helped avoid that problem in certain investigations because they supplied specific evidence linking him to particular victims. But they could not answer every question. The uncertainty surrounding the total number of victims remains part of the historical record. What can be said with confidence is that Woodfield's criminal activity extended beyond the single murder for which he was convicted. The investigation established his responsibility for Sherry Hull's death and Beth Wilmot's attempted murder. Later forensic evidence linked him to additional murders, including the deaths of Donna Eckerd, Janelle Jarvis, and Julie Wrights. Other cases, including those of Sherry Ayers and Darcy Fix and Douglas Altig, became part of the broader investigation and were later associated with him through forensic evidence. But the total scope of his crimes cannot be reduced to one universally accepted number. The uncertainty is not a reason to dismiss the investigation. It is a reason to describe it accurately. The case of Randall Woodfield ultimately became a study in the difference between suspicion and proof. In 1980, investigators could suspect him and still have to let him walk free. In 1981, the evidence surrounding Hull and Wilmot became strong enough for a conviction. Decades later, advances in DNA and forensic science allowed investigators to return to old cases and establish connections that had previously been impossible. Each stage added another layer to the story. Yet no single stage answered everything. The investigation could prove some things, establish others through forensic evidence, and leave still more unresolved. That may be the most honest way to understand the legacy of the I-5 investigation. It was not a perfect story in which every crime eventually received a definitive answer. It was a long process of separating fact from possibility, using whatever evidence was available at each point in time. And behind every distinction, convicted, forensically linked, suspected, were victims whose lives had been permanently altered or ended. The responsibility of remembering this case is therefore not simply to repeat the largest possible number of victims. It is to preserve the difference between what investigators knew, what science later established, and what may never be known. That distinction is where the truth of the Woodfield case remains. By the time the investigation surrounding Randall Woodfield had expanded beyond the crimes for which he was originally convicted, one fact had become increasingly clear. The arrest and conviction had not produced a complete ending. Woodfield was in prison, but investigators still had to determine how many other crimes could legitimately be connected to him. Some answers came from forensic evidence years later. Other questions remained unresolved. The distinction between those two outcomes is essential because the Woodfield case is often remembered through its largest claims rather than through the limits of what could actually be established. The name I-5 killer suggests a complete story, but the evidence describes something more complicated. One confirmed murder conviction in the principal trial, several additional cases later linked through forensic evidence, and a wider group of suspected crimes whose connection remained uncertain. The first unanswered question concerns the true number of victims. Different sources have cited different figures. Some have referred to 18 victims. Other investigators and researchers have suggested 25, or even as many as 44. But those numbers cannot be treated as equivalent. The largest figure includes cases that were suspected rather than conclusively proven. Woodfield was not convicted of 44 murders. He was convicted of murdering Sherry Hull, attempting to murder Beth Wilmot, and committing related sexual offenses. Later forensic evidence linked him to additional killings. Other cases remain possible connections. The exact number of victims, therefore, remains disputed. This uncertainty is not a minor detail. It changes the way the entire case should be described. If every suspected case were presented as an established murder, the historical record would become more certain than the evidence allows. A careful investigation must resist that temptation. The second unanswered question concerns the individual cases that surrounded Woodfield before and after his conviction. Sherry Ayers was killed on October 9, 1980. Her family immediately suspected Woodfield because of their history with him. He was questioned, but investigators could not prosecute him. The blood type associated with Woodfield did not match the blood type identified from semen in the investigation, and he refused a polygraph examination. At the time, that left investigators without sufficient evidence. Later DNA technology allowed investigators to revisit biological evidence and establish connections that had not been possible in 1980. That development changed the understanding of the case, but it also demonstrated how much investigators had been forced to work without. The same problem appeared after the November 27th killings of Darcy Fix and Douglas Altig. Woodfield knew Fix through a friend, and investigators considered him a suspect. According to the supplied information, he came to the house intending to attack Fix, and both Fix and Altig were shot. A .32 caliber handgun belonging to Fix disappeared from the scene. Yet investigators did not have enough evidence to prosecute Woodfield at that time. Years later, forensic evidence helped associate the killings with him. Again, the case moved from suspicion toward a stronger evidentiary connection, but the original investigation had not possessed that evidence. These cases raise a broader question. How many other crimes may have contained evidence that investigators could not interpret with the technology of the time? The answer is impossible to know. Some evidence may have been preserved and later examined. Other evidence may have been insufficient, degraded, or unavailable. The passage of time can help an investigation through scientific progress, but it can also limit what can still be recovered. That uncertainty is particularly important when considering the crimes along Interstate 5. Investigators had already identified a geographical pattern through telephone records and other information. Woodfield appeared to move repeatedly through Washington, Oregon, and California. The pattern was striking enough to help investigators connect crimes that initially seemed unrelated. But geography could not identify a killer by itself. A person traveling along Interstate 5 was not automatically responsible for every violent crime committed there. The map provided direction, not final proof. The third major unanswered question concerns the full extent of Woodfield's movement and activity during the crucial months between late 1980 and early 1981. The supplied information describes a rapid sequence of crimes. On December 9th, a Vancouver, Washington gas station was robbed. 4 days later, an ice cream shop in Eugene was robbed. The next day, a drive-in restaurant in Albany was attacked. On December 21st, a female restaurant employee in Seattle was restrained and sexually assaulted while being threatened with a gun. On January 8th, Woodfield was believed to have returned to the same Vancouver gas station that had previously been robbed. On January 11th, a Eugene store was robbed. On January 12th, Susie Benet was shot in Sutherland and survived. On January 18th, Sherry Hull was killed and Beth Wilmot survived an attempted murder. On February 3rd, Donna Eckerd and Janelle Jarvis were killed in California. On February 15th, Julie Wrights was killed in Beaverton. This sequence illustrates why investigators began seeing the crimes as part of a larger pattern. But it also raises questions that the surviving evidence cannot fully answer. Which crimes were committed by Woodfield? Which were committed by someone else? Were there attacks that were never reported? Were there victims whose cases were never connected? And were there cases that appeared similar but actually had different offenders? Without a confession, investigators had to approach each question through evidence. Woodfield never provided a complete account of his activities. He did not confess to the murders associated with him, and he did not give investigators a final list of victims. This means that the historical record must remain dependent on physical evidence, witness accounts, records, and later forensic analysis. The absence of a confession also creates another unanswered question. What was Woodfield's own explanation for the evidence against him? In the Hull and Wilmot prosecution, the evidence was sufficient for conviction. Beth Wilmot identified him, and prosecutors presented physical evidence including hair and bullets, along with other testimony and evidence. The jury deliberated for approximately 3.5 hours before finding him guilty on June 26, 1981. But the trial established responsibility for specific offenses. It did not provide a comprehensive narrative of every crime investigators suspected. The courtroom therefore produced a legal answer, but not necessarily a complete historical explanation. Another unresolved issue concerns the relationship between the different categories of evidence. Telephone records helped investigators understand Woodfield's movements. Witnesses provided descriptions and identifications. Physical evidence connected individuals, weapons, or crime scenes. Later DNA technology supplied additional forensic links. Each type of evidence contributed something different, but none should automatically be treated as equivalent. A telephone record may indicate where someone was communicating from. A witness identification may establish that someone resembled or was recognized as the offender. A forensic result may establish a biological connection. The strength of a criminal case depends on how these pieces fit together. In Woodfield's case, the eventual conviction came from that combination rather than from a single dramatic discovery. The same principle applies to the later cases. A forensic connection can be powerful, but it does not necessarily answer every question surrounding a murder. It may identify an offender without reconstructing exactly how the crime unfolded. It may establish that evidence is associated with a person without revealing motive, sequence, or every circumstance. That is why some questions remain even after a case has been connected to a known offender. There is also the question of whether Woodfield acted entirely alone. The supplied information identifies no confirmed accomplice. Yet, because the crimes occurred across a wide geographical area and involved many separate incidents, the possibility has remained one of the broader questions surrounding the investigation. Without evidence establishing an accomplice, however, it would be irresponsible to state that someone else participated. The same caution applies to the question of motive. Woodfield had previously admitted to crimes involving robbery and sexual violence and had cited problems controlling sexual urges and steroid use when he was arrested in 1975. But those facts do not provide a complete explanation for the later murders. The victims and circumstances varied, and Woodfield himself never supplied a full account of his motivations. Any attempt to construct a definitive psychological explanation would therefore go beyond the evidence provided. Perhaps the most painful unanswered question concerns the victims whose cases may never be conclusively resolved. When a murder is linked to a known offender years later, a family may finally receive an answer that had been unavailable for decades. But when a suspected connection remains only a suspicion, the uncertainty continues. The Woodfield investigation demonstrates both possibilities. Some cases were strengthened through later forensic evidence. Others remained in a more uncertain category. That uncertainty should not be mistaken for failure. Investigators can only establish what the evidence allows them to establish. The responsibility is to avoid turning possibility into fact simply because the story would be more satisfying that way. The legacy of the I-5 investigation therefore lies partly in its unanswered questions. The number of victims may never be known with certainty. The full extent of Woodfield's crimes may never be reconstructed. Some cases may remain forever in the category of suspicion. Other cases may continue to be reevaluated as forensic technology develops. What is certain is that Woodfield was convicted of murdering Sherry Hull and attempting to murder Beth Wilmot, and that later forensic evidence connected him to additional murders. Beyond those established facts, the evidence must be allowed to speak for itself. The most responsible conclusion is not that every mystery has been solved. It is that investigators gradually transformed a collection of seemingly unrelated crimes into a body of evidence connecting Woodfield to multiple victims, while still acknowledging the cases that could not be proven. That distinction protects the integrity of the investigation and, more importantly, the identities of the people whose lives were taken. The highway may have provided the geographical thread, but it never provided all the answers. The remaining questions are part of the history of the case, and perhaps they always will be.